2021 President's Lifetime Achievement Award recipient. Founding partner of the John Maxwell team. Toastmaster International Speech Competition semi-finalist. Founder of Tell It Like It Is TV, ThatGuyRocks.com and ThatGuySpeaks.com. Creator of Story Power TV, Transforming Grace TV, and Leading Leaders podcast. Producer of 4 TV programs and podcasts for Liftable TV and World Trumpet Television, as well as multiple social media channels. Please help me welcome J Loren Norris.
You know, there are a whole lot of leaders who have stories on their brain, stories that they like to tell. Usually they're stories that make them out to be the hero. They're stories that make them look like angels from heaven going to ascend when you bring them in to take over their company or hire them as a trainer, a mentor, a coach. These are stories that are self-aggrandizing. They're stories that are fantabulous. Some of them straight up hard to believe. Like the story of the guy who fought the dinosaur with a broomstick and won. Yeah, some of them are stories like that. Those are not the kind of stories that you need to be telling. But there are 6 stories that every leader should be telling. And these are stories that need to be intentionally selected and well crafted. And that's what we're going to talk about in this episode of Leading Leaders. Stay tuned.
Subscribe now for our extensive video library of leadership lessons promoting faith, family, and freedom.
I'm J Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast, and I can tell you there are a lot of people I've heard tell stories that, in all honesty, when they finish, they say something like, I'm not even sure why I told you that story, I thought it was fascinating, or I found it fascinating myself. Now, there's the damage that you can do telling stories, number one, that are, well, they're not your own. They're anecdotal. Maybe they sound like great stories. I was just listening to a guy teaching that was telling a story that he heard from somebody else, from a family that lived in 1920. Now, I can't question the validity of a story that happened in 1920. I wasn't there. In fact, I don't know anybody who was there. Since my grandmother passed at 92 years old, I haven't had a whole lot of conversations. I can't think of anyone that I've had a conversation with who was alive in 1920, because right now that would make them 100 plus years old. It's a little complicated to have a firsthand story of something you lived through. Now, the whole purpose of well-selected and well-crafted stories is to be able to pass down those things that nobody's going to know about otherwise. In fact, I truly believe that the most powerful weapon we have against tyranny, personal tyranny, governmental tyranny, spiritual tyranny, relational tyranny, like of a narcissist, the most powerful weapon we have against any of those things is the stories of the freedom that we've lived through. The ability through our story to say, it hasn't always been like that, and it won't always be like this. Those 2 statements alone carry a whole lot of power in them. Can you imagine, say 1921, Germany, a Jewish family, living at the height of their success, building a business. Perhaps they make ballpoint pens called the Mont Blanc. And 10 years later, their children are being rounded up. See, all of a sudden you've got a whole different perspective, and you've got to look at it and go, that's the difference between elementary school and high school graduation, that amount of time. Well, stories that are intentionally selected and well crafted tell the truth about an era like that because you lived through it. Now, this first of the 6 stories that every leader must be able to tell, again, every one of these 6 stories will be personal, private, yours, firsthand. You've lived through them. How do we know that? Well, Dale Carnegie says if you're going to tell a story, it has to be qualified. Here's how you qualify a story. You ready? You should write this down. qualify your story by passing it through the filter of the 3 E's. Have you earned the right to tell about it? Are you eager to tell it? And can you tell it with enthusiasm? Now, enthusiasm doesn't always mean, yay! Enthusiasm might mean, I'm devoted to delivering this story, even if it brings me to tears to do it. Even if I know that it's going to bring others to tears when I tell it, it's that important. I'm enthusiastic to deliver it. It's not some humdrum, hoo-ha kind of a story that you're like, oh, whatever. It's not a kind of a story. It's a wow kind of a story. For good or bad, for better, for worse, it's that kind of story. All right, here's the first one of those kinds of stories that every leader has to develop. This is the build credibility story. You've got to build credibility. So this is the first of 6. Now, the build credibility story is that story that you tell that when people hear it, they realize you're not necessarily bragging. You're just stating some facts, but they're so well crafted into the story that people realize you know what you're talking about. You've got some earned credibility. You've got some street cred, as well as perhaps some doctrinal cred, some educational cred, you've got the credibility of doing this, not just the credentials. Credentials are important, but how many of you met somebody who has great credentials and they don't have great credibility? Oh, they've been to school for it. They've got the license, the certification for it. They just never actually done it. I was talking with a client yesterday who was raised in an industry from the time they were a toddler. Both parents in that industry, absolute experts, consummate level, world-renowned experts in that industry. This client was raised up in that industry, has seen it for almost their entire life, but then also went to school for the same industry, received undergrad, graduate, and a couple of postgraduate degrees along with that to say, I'm not just listening to what my parents said, but I've been trained in the industry. I'm experienced in the industry. I've got all this credibility. Now, you can imagine, for some people, that level of credibility, it's a little overwhelming. I'll tell you what else it is. When it's stated well, when it's crafted into the story well, you tell that story of massive amounts of credibility and the little insights that you've learned along the way. And you also have the opportunity to point out some of the things that are, well, they're slang or they're ideas, they're fads, they're trends. They've been tried over and over again. And every time they're tried, they make somebody a little bit of money, but they don't work for everybody else. That's what that kind of longevity in an industry says. I have, in my family, I have nurses. In my family, I have people who work in the medical field at various levels. I was trained as a firefighter and a first responder, took a lot of classes on EMT and first response and emergency medicine and that kind of stuff just because I had to. But when it comes to nursing and dietitians and how do you treat various things, I go to the experts. I have a little bit of experience with it, but I'm not a credible expert in that by any stretch of the imagination. So I defer. But my credibility is that I know when to say, I don't know. I talk about things that I know well because I've studied them, because I've had those conversations, because I've sat right here at this table and had in-depth 2-hour-long interviews on topics that are way over my head. I've never been trained in them, but I now have knowledge in them. The credibility that comes from the experiences in your life, the things that you tried and they failed. There's a reason to tell those stories because they're not just, I have the paper on the wall. They are, I have the paper on the wall and I tried what my professors told me and it didn't work out so well. The stories of credibility are not the anecdotes of someone else's experience. They're the evidence of your own. You've got to tell stories of credibility to prove that you haven't just researched it, you've lived through it. Now, in the 3 E's, they earn the right, be eager to tell it with enthusiasm. Earn the right also could mean that you lived through it firsthand, you witnessed it as it happened, or you've done thorough research in the field. If you've done thorough research in the field, if you've read 10 books on the topic cover to cover, if you've studied it for decades, you're probably pretty credible in that category. Just understand what your limits are and understand where you've got to go, I don't know. That's a new one on me. I'm going to dig into it and do some research. Building credibility is one reason to tell a story, and it's one kind of story that you really should take the time to intentionally select which stories you're going to tell to the audience in front of you, and you should take the time to craft that story into something that doesn't sound like a resume or a braggadocious event, but it sounds like, hey, I'm just telling you what I've lived through and what I witnessed, and that's going to make a big difference. All right, second story, build emotional connection story. You've got to build emotional connection. I can't tell you how many people I've worked with that when they go through their life events, they start talking about the things that they've been a part of, and it sounds like the circus barker narrating from afar. It's not that the story didn't really happen. It's not that the evidence isn't there. It's just that you wouldn't know that they lived through it because there's nothing in them that feels like an emotional event. They saw it from a distance. They watched from afar. It wasn't really a moment they lived through in the way that they tell the story. Now, that's not to say that they didn't actually live through the story. It's not questioning their credibility. It's questioning their delivery. And if you lived through a story and it was emotional and there were rise and falls and moments of excitement and maybe even in the moment that it happened, you had that emotional sense that you wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. You were so excited that it was happening and terrified at the same time. I've been there. I have those moments. There are a couple of stories that I tell now that when I recall them, when I relive them as I tell them, I want to laugh and cry at the same time again as I'm telling the story. I can feel my eyes water. I can feel my sinuses begin to react differently to the emotions in me because the hippocampus and the hypothalamus are doing their work as a brain does, and I'm feeling that moment again. A good building emotional connection story doesn't sound like you're narrating it from afar. It sounds like you're reliving it. Now, word of caution. Dennis the Menace once said, I feel like I slept too close to the edge of the bed that I got in. And there are a whole lot of people that live right on the edge of the emotions and they haven't quite found the healing in it. They're not stable enough to say, I can relive this, I can feel this without being emotionally lost in the moment again. That little, just the flip of a switch of the healing that happens as you tell this story a few times. And it's why I tell my clients, I want you to rehearse this story dozens of times before you ever take it to the platform. Dozens of times before you say it in front of a camera. The first couple of times that you say it to me, I'm going to help you work out some of those word choices, some of those emotional rise and fall moments. And there's a real good chance that you're going to stumble across a couple of those words that just trip you up. And there's a chance that you're going to say some things that in your emotional reliving of the moment, they're not really true. And that's part of my job as your story power coach is to listen for those things and go, okay, hold on. I heard you say this. Is that true? Is that evidenced? Can we prove it? Would it be the same for everybody else who went through the same experience? And if the answer is no, then maybe we need to find another way to reword that, or maybe we need to ask, is that a valid expression of what you want to say? There's a lot of power in knowing the difference. And I spend a lot of time with my clients on that, especially those deep emotional connections. But if you don't build emotional connection, then the audience doesn't buy into the idea that you know the pain they're going through. Third story, build your emotional brand. Now, there are a whole lot of people who have, and we saw this in the last set of live trainings that we did. We brought people to a platform where the stage was 40 feet by 50 feet. It was 60 inches off the ground. It was an enormous 27,000 square foot room. You could have put 2,500 to 3,000 people in that room as an audience. Huge. And it's real easy to think when you come out on that audience, I'm just going to be me. I'm just going to tell my story. I'm just going to do it my way. And if you're not connecting with people that are 250 feet away in the back of the room and 350 feet at the corners, this is like a baseball field kind of space. If your energy is not enough, if your intensity is not enough, you don't connect with them. But see, if your emotional brand is small, diminutive, if what people expect of you is that soft, quiet coach, that soothing voice, that Delilah in the night or Dr. Ruth on the radio. Any one of those is fine. But if you're not a Tony Robbins, rah, rah, rah kind of a guy, always moving people around, always getting them up out of their seats, always jumping around, then a large platform like that may not serve you or your audience well. The ability to look right into the camera, sometimes to intentionally move right toward the camera, to have that intimate personal conversation with someone. That's not theatrics. That's an emotional brand. It's what people expect of you. It's who you are to them. It's who they expect you to be. And the story that establishes your emotional brand is the one that says, maybe you've heard this phrase, how does that make you feel? Now, if I were to ask anybody that's grown up in the last 15 years, where did you hear that first? Well, Dr. Phil says it all the time. When he first broke out of his morning radio show in the Dallas-Fort Worth market and began to do things with Oprah Winfrey and the O Network, when she discovered him, if you will, and started putting him on television, that kind of became a signature tagline. He would listen to people tell their stories, their backgrounds, their rants, whatever it was, and then he would say, well, how does that make you feel? Why? Well, because your emotions are significant. But he's now got a little more of a direct approach, a little more of I don't want to say aggressive, I will say a forthright way of saying, maybe your feelings are wrong. I love to listen to Dr. Jordan Peterson as he digs into the psychoanalysis of even historical events. That his emotional brand is, I have enough training in this field. I've studied enough people. I've studied enough history. I'm not listening for your nonsense. His forthrightness, his directness, his approach is very distinct from anybody else in the field. I listen to high intellectuals talk with him, and Eric Metaxas told me the other day in a conversation, he said, you're getting very Jungian on me. Well, Carl Jung was a psychologist from way back. He had a very specific emotional brand, a very specific approach. And when phraseology seems to match up with his philosophy, like Freud, when those things tend to match up, it's easy enough to stamp that emotional brand and go, you're sounding very Freudian. You're sounding very Jungian. You're sounding very Peterson to me. That emotional brand is so significant that if people see you as brash, curt, outgoing, direct, that's what they expect of you. And when you're outside that brand, that's a challenge because a lot of people lose their believability, which now goes back to your first credibility story. Your emotional connection may be right on target, but if it's not consistent with your emotional brand, you lose people. They don't get what they expect of you. My kids have seen me all over the board as they've grown up. Early on, I have no self-control of my anger. It very, 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 very seldom became physical, never became violent toward my family at all. But I would raise my voice, and I have a big booming voice. And I know how to project that. I could overmodulate the mic without even trying. And when I would lose my cool, I would yell at my kids. Years ago, decades ago. But they've seen that change in me, and a lot of people see me as a very quiet coach sitting in the corner of the room and just listening, paying attention, and they think, he gets loud? Really? It's an emotional brand. What they expect of me. And when I get loud, some of them get teary. Some of them feel intimidated. They get triggered. They don't realize that I have a dynamic range. I have the ability to speak in front of 40,000 people. I've done it. Speak in front of 14 people. I've done it. Train one-on-one. I've done it. Walk through some of the hardest memories of somebody's life. I've done it. And I know what emotional regulation looks like. But my emotional brand is a little different than that, and you're going to have to get to know me to know what that is. The story that builds trust. This is number 4. The story that builds trust is that one that says, here's why people know they can trust me, because the promises that I've made, the commitments that I've made, I delivered on. You can trust me, and here's the evidence. These are the relationships where even when I had to make a sacrifice to keep the promises that I made, I made the sacrifice. I can demonstrate through relationships that I can point out to you, through people that I can introduce you to, that if I tell you I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. That's trust. That evidence of trust. Now, it's hard sometimes for people to trust, not because of you, but because of their past experiences. Sometimes just the idea of trust me is a trigger all on its own because some narcissist has already damaged that trust factor in them, and yet you still have to be able to tell a story that says, here's how I know you can trust me. If I had time, I would go into the story. Beautiful young woman that was one of our classes a while back in February of 21, I believe it was, when she encountered the experience of the Story Power Masterclass Live, in her own words, it triggered her. And she said, I feel like you're using stories the same way that my ex-husband did when he destroyed our marriage and our family and took everything from me. And I'm getting very angry. And there was a moment, and if you go back in several of my podcasts, you'll find it. I've talked about it a couple of times, but there was a moment where I demonstrated to her that she could trust me and how she knew it was true. And we have a pretty good relationship now. The ability to demonstrate how and why someone knows they can trust you, you're going to have to intentionally select the stories that you tell, and you're going to have to craft them very well, because building trust is a risk factor for you and the people you're trying to build trust with. Just to say, trust me, that's a fail from the very beginning. You better have some evidence. You better have some relationships that people can verify and go, tell me about this. A lot of people count on the Google reviews or the Yelp reviews to say you can trust them because 5,000 people have said, I got a good deal. Great. But to what extent? Or what kind of trust was extended to get that good review? That's a different thing. You're going to have to build a bridge over objections. This is story number 5. You've got to build a bridge over objections, ideally before they happen. And what I mean by that is, you know where people's objections are. Is it price? Is it value? Is it trust? Is it they don't believe that what you've promised you can actually deliver on? Now, if the stories that you have intentionally selected in your presentation, in your job interview, in your first face-to-face sit down over coffee, in the first interaction that you have with your audience or your client, if you've taken the time to choose to select the story, intentionally select and well craft the story, then you've already looked at the objections that most people are going to have. Well, I can't trust you because. Well, I won't buy it because of this price. Well, I bought one of those before and it didn't work. You know what those objections are. You know who your competitors are. You know what the problems that most of your people face are. You know when the last time you closed the deal, what the resistance was. Craft the story to illustrate that and how the win happened anyway. You're building a bridge over objections they haven't even expressed yet. Maybe it's right now just bubbling up in their subconscious mind and they're thinking, when they get to the point, I'm going to say, and then when you diffuse that by addressing the fact that somebody else has already been there, it bubbled up in them as well, and you were able to meet it, overcome the objection by solving the problem that they presented, you've diffused their ability to use that same objection. Now, that doesn't mean they won't have any others, but if you know you have some common objections to what you do, the business that you're in, the way that you serve, the solutions that you provide, then you can overcome those objections by telling stories about those objections and how you met them before you get into that. That's a really powerful thing to have in your pocket. And I highly recommend that you take some time to intentionally select and well craft those stories. Don't use them flippantly. You got to put them at the right place in your presentation, at the right place in your relationship. If you jump out there with those too early, you're overselling. That doesn't nurture the relationship. That blows it out of the water. Be cautious with that. And finally, you've got to build a commitment of expectations. So your story basically says, here's my promise to you. Here's the other people I promised it to. Here's how I delivered it to them. That's kind of the call to action in advance. It's a matter of saying, I want to match the promises that I made. I want to give you the evidence that when I make those promises, I deliver on those promises, because I made that promise to this person. And this is the result that they got from the promises being delivered. And this is where we are now. Oh, when I tell you about my friend who lost trust because they were triggered in that evidence of their own experiences versus what I was teaching, I had to come back with evidence to say, you can trust me to do this. And at one point, I literally said, if you believe that I care about you, then I also need you to understand that I know I have emotionally pushed you off a cliff. But if you trust me, then understand that I'm jumping right behind you. And my intention is to catch you, and I'm the only one with a parachute. Now, if you believe that's true, if you believe that all of the people that I've worked with in the past have also come to the same precipice and realized I'm at the edge and I can choose to stay where I'm at, or I can jump into the unknown. And I can jump into the unknown knowing that my coach is going with me into the unknown and has some experience here. And by the way, has a parachute. This is like a tandem jump. If you can believe that, then let's jump together. Just to understand that I'm going with you. I've been here before. I know how to handle this parachute. I know about the upwinds. I know about the drafts. I know about the crosswinds. I know how to get us to the ground safely. I've been in the same place that you are now, and I've been in the same place that you're going. That's the evidence. That's that bridge over objections, but it's also the trust bridge built together to display that I can help. And it's also the commitment to the expectations. I'm telling you, I'm going to get you to the ground safely. I've done it with more than one person. I've done it in the past, and I'm going to do it for you. And if you believe that, then let's jump. And if you don't believe that, I understand. Maybe this isn't for you. Maybe it's not the right time. Maybe I'm not the person that you trust. Maybe my emotional brand doesn't resonate with you. I get that. But if there's any chance that you trust me, let's jump together. Those 6 stories, you can't just make them up. You've got to be very intentional about them. There's some elements in each of those 6 stories that are so finitely defined that one word, the wrong emotion delivered, the wrong expectations set, the wrong promises made will destroy your brand, destroy your credibility. No amount of marketing will overcome it. I had a client once who asked me to help write a speech to win a political contest. When we sat down and talked about it, they've got some great fodder, great experiences, great education, great life stories that were, evidence to the power of understanding the marketplace of what needs to change where they wanted to work was off the charts. But they came to a juncture where it was going to potentially cost their marriage. And they said, I told my spouse I'm ready to move forward with this, with or without them. And I said, hold on. I've done a little opposition research. I know who you're running against. I know what their platform is. I know what they're running on. I know the who that they are and why they do what they do. And I'm going to tell you right now, just the fact that you're willing to make that statement destroys your credibility. No quality of speech writing, no amount of enthusiasm, no amount of eagerness to tell the story is going to overwhelm the fact that your character is your downfall. The fact that what you want so badly that you'll sacrifice your relationship for it. In any other circumstance, that's laudable dedication. In this circumstance, that choice makes your opponent superior. I can't write a speech that good. Nobody can, unless they're willing to lie. And I'm not willing to lie. Not for you, not for me, not for anybody else. If you want a good, true speech, let's talk about another campaign. Let's talk about another election. Let's talk about another race. Let's talk about another option. And they did. And they raised some money and they went into the election and they didn't win. But then they also came back and said, I thank you that my marriage and my relationship is still intact because you pressed me on the promises I was willing to make versus the commitment I had to live up to. My friends, you cannot just choose a story because it wins the day. You've got to choose a story because it's true, because it's authentically you, because it possesses the power to demonstrate all of these things. Build credibility, build emotional brand, build emotional connection, build trust, build a bridge over the objections that you know are coming, and then build this commitment so that people know when you make a promise, you're going to keep it and they can count on it. If you'll build those 6 stories, you will build a great business, a great brand, and deeper influence as a leader. And if you need help with those things, you can find me at storypowercoach.com. You can jump on there right now and schedule a call. We can spend an hour together to talk through whether or not this is a good fit. There's still an investment, but I promise it'll be worth your time. I'm J Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast and storypowercoach.com. Have a blessed day.
Loren is a master teacher on storytelling, and I learned so much. I'm really going to have to sit down and go back through everything, and I think I might have to have some more coffees with Loren, but it was totally worth my time, and I really highly recommend it if you're looking to grow your ministry, grow your business, grow your career. Loren will serve you well.
Thank you.